I had always loved the solitude of my cabin in the forest. It was a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. Surrounded by towering trees and the gentle hum of nature, I felt a sense of peace and tranquility that was hard to find elsewhere. But that sense of peace was shattered one stormy night that I will never forget. The day had been warm and sunny, but as evening approached, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. By the time I finished my dinner, the wind had picked up, and the first raindrops were tapping against the windows. I settled into my favorite armchair with a book, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm circle of light around me. As the storm intensified, the sound of thunder rumbled through the forest, and flashes of lightning illuminated the room. I found the storm oddly comforting, the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof like a lullaby. Little did I know that the night would soon take a turn for the worse. I was deep into my book when I heard the first strange noise. It was a faint scratching sound, almost imperceptible over the din of the storm. I brushed it off as a branch scraping against the side of the cabin. But then, it came again. Louder this time, and I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I set my book down and listened intently. The scratching continued, irregular and persistent. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was a blur of shadows and movement, the wind whipping the trees into a frenzy. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the noise persisted. I told myself it was just my imagination, amplified by the storm and the isolation. But as I turned to go back to my chair, a flash of lightning lit up the yard, and I saw a fleeting figure darting between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved felt off. I tried to shake off the unease and return to my book, but I couldn't focus. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified, and my mind kept wandering back to the figure I had seen. Just as I was starting to calm down, my phone rang, startling me. I picked it up, relieved to see my friend Tom's name on the screen. "Hey Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, how's the cabin life?" he asked, his voice cheerful. "It's good, just a bit stormy tonight." "Yeah, I saw the weather report. Figured I'd check in on you. Everything all right?" I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to tell him about the strange noises and the figure I had seen. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I also didn't want to ignore my gut feeling. "Actually, something weird happened," I said finally. "I heard some scratching outside, and I thought I saw someone in the yard." Tom's tone changed immediately. "Did you call the police?" "No, I mean, it could just be an animal, but it freaked me out a bit. Better safe than sorry. Keep your doors locked, and if you hear anything else, call the cops. Okay?" "Okay, thanks, Tom." After we hung up, I double-checked all the locks and made sure the windows were secure. I felt a bit better after talking to Tom, but the sense of unease lingered. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but the storm had other plans. Just as the tension in the film was reaching its peak, the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I cursed under my breath and fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the drawer by the couch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and I felt a little more in control. I checked my phone, hoping the battery would last until the power came back. The storm was still raging outside, and the cabin felt like a tiny, fragile boat in the middle of a vast, angry sea. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would take my mind off things. I made my way to the bedroom, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. As I crawled into bed, I heard the scratching noise again, louder this time. It was coming from the back door. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept down the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The scratching was more insistent now, a desperate clawing sound that sent chills down my spine. I reached the back door and stood there, listening. I took a deep breath and flung the door open, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain. There was nothing there. The scratching stopped abruptly, and all I could hear was the roar of the storm. I stepped outside, the rain soaking me instantly, and shone the flashlight around. The yard was empty. Feeling foolish, I stepped back inside and locked the door. I must have been imagining things, I told myself. The storm and the isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But as I turned to head back to bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the muddy footprints I had left on the floor, there was another set of prints. Smaller, bare feet, leading from the back door down the hallway. I followed them with the flashlight, my heart in my throat. They led to the basement door. I stood there, staring at the basement door, my mind racing. I hadn't been down there in weeks, and I couldn't think of any reason why there would be footprints leading to it. The logical part of my brain told me to call the police, but another part of me wanted to confront whatever, or whoever, was down there. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the flashlight beam dancing off the walls. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture and boxes of junk. I swept the beam around, looking for any sign of an intruder. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a faint, raspy breathing. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, and my heart nearly stopped. There, huddled in the corner, was a small, frail figure. It looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. The figure was a child, no older than 8 or 9, with matted hair and dirt-streaked clothes. He looked like he had been living in the woods for weeks. My initial fear gave way to concern as I took in his appearance. "Hey, it's okay," I said softly, trying to calm him. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't respond, just stared at me with those wide, frightened eyes. I took a step closer, and he recoiled, pressing himself against the wall. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. After a moment, he nodded slowly. I sighed in relief and put the flashlight down, reaching out a hand. "Come on, let's get you out of here," I said. I led the boy upstairs and wrapped him in a blanket, trying to warm him up. He still hadn't spoken, but he seemed a little less scared now. I made him a cup of hot chocolate and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "What's your name?" I asked. "Sam," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Okay, Sam. Do you know how you got here?" He shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't remember," he said, his voice trembling. I felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. He was clearly traumatized, and I had no idea what he had been through. I decided to call the police and let them handle it. They would know what to do. But as I reached for my phone, the power came back on, and with it, the cabin's security system. The beeping of the alarm startled Sam, and he jumped up, looking around in panic. "It's okay. It's just the alarm," I said, trying to reassure him. "Let me turn it off." I punched in the code, and the beeping stopped. But as I turned back to Sam, I noticed something strange. The security log showed a series of entries and exits through the back door over the past week, all at odd hours of the night. A cold dread settled over me as I realized what that meant. Sam hadn't just wandered into my cabin during the storm. He had been coming and going for days, maybe even weeks, without me noticing. How had he managed to do that without setting off the alarm? I turned to Sam, my mind racing. "Sam, have you been here before?" He looked down at his hands, avoiding my gaze. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, sympathy. This boy had been living in my cabin without my knowledge, sneaking around while I slept. But he was also just a scared child, clearly in need of help. Before I could ask any more questions, there was a loud knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding. Who could be out here in the middle of the storm? I glanced at Sam, who looked just as terrified as I felt. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight and heading to the door. I peered through the peephole but couldn't see anyone. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I took a deep breath and opened the door, shining the flashlight into the night. There was no one there. I stepped outside, the rain lashing against me, and looked around. The yard was empty, just as it had been earlier. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the mud, were fresh footprints, adult-sized, leading from the forest to my front door and then disappearing back into the woods. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my mind racing. Someone had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I couldn't stay here. We had to get out. "Sam, we need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. I grabbed my keys and the flashlight, and we hurried out to the car. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see, but I managed to get us both inside and started the engine. As we drove away from the cabin, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. But there was nothing. Just the dark, rain-soaked forest. We drove in silence for a while, the tension in the car palpable. I kept the headlights on high beam, trying to pierce the darkness ahead. Sam was huddled in the passenger seat, still wrapped in the blanket. "Where are we going?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere safe," I replied, hoping it was true. We reached the main road, and I felt a small sense of relief. The lights of the town were just ahead, a beacon of safety in the storm. I pulled into the parking lot of the nearest police station and parked the car. "Let's go inside," I said, opening the door. Inside the station, the warmth and light were a stark contrast to the storm outside. I explained everything to the officer at the desk, finding Sam in my basement, the strange noises, the footprints. They took us into a back room and brought us hot drinks, trying to make us feel comfortable. As they questioned Sam, he slowly opened up about his ordeal. He had been living in the forest with his father, who had become increasingly unstable and abusive. One night, Sam had run away and found refuge in my cabin. He had been too scared to come forward, afraid his father would find him. The police assured us that they would find Sam's father and make sure he was safe. They also promised to keep an eye on my cabin in case the man returned. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The storm had passed, but the memory of that night lingered. I kept thinking about the footprints, the strange noises, and the figure I had seen in the yard. Sam was placed in foster care, and I visited him regularly. He seemed to be doing better, slowly healing from his traumatic experience. But I couldn't help but wonder about his father, still out there somewhere. I returned to the cabin, determined not to let fear control me. I installed better security and tried to move on with my life. But every time a storm rolled in, I felt that familiar sense of dread, the memory of that night in the forest never far from my mind. One evening, as I was sitting by the fireplace, I received a call from the police. They had found Sam's father, wandering the forest in a state of delirium. He had been taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. I felt a mix of relief and unease. The immediate threat was gone, but the questions remained. How long had he been watching us? What had he been planning? The forest was quiet now, the storms less frequent. But I knew that the tranquility was fragile, easily shattered by the unknown. And as I sat there, listening to the crackling of the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that some mysteries were best left unsolved.